What is up, guys? Quinn Hennick here of Clinical Athlete. This is a tutorial video to talk about the daily and weekly metrics, as well as the data analysis tab on the patellar tendinopathy Clinical Athlete Rehab templates. So this is phase one of the patellar tendinopathy rehab template for weightlifters. And you can see I've got a day populated here. We've got metrics called exercise tonnage here in phase one. Exercise tonnage is sets times reps times weight, or in the case of the isometrics, it's duration. So sets times duration times weight is going to give you a tonnage value. And then absolute intensity is the heaviest load utilized for any specific exercise. So a wall sit can be a body weight exercise. So let's say this athlete weighs 150 pounds. That's where we put in 150. Now let's say for set 3, so he's going to do one more set for 30 seconds. And he's going to hold 25-pound dumbbells in each hand, which takes the total load, body weight plus the 50 pounds, to 200. You can see that calculates into the exercise tonnage. And now his highest absolute intensity value for the wall sit for that day is 200. The same would work for split squats here. Let's say you just wanted to go a little bit heavier and hold heavier loads, heavier weights, and it calculates. Now we've got daily metrics. We've got daily totals here. So we get the sum of our exercise tonnage goes here, and the sum or the absolute intensity goes here. So we pick the heaviest of these values is going to be reflected right there. So we know that 250 pounds was the heaviest load imparted on this athlete today. And then we rate the session. So the session RPE, the SRPE, let's say you gave it a 9. Session duration is going to be in minutes. We'll say, let's change it so you can see that it populates 70 minutes. And it auto calculates the session score, which is basically how we're going to track training load over time. And AU stands for arbitrary units. You can call that whatever you want, gains units, I don't care. But the session score is populated by multiplying the session RPE and the session duration. And down here, we have the weekly total. So let's say this entire week was populated with values, weekly tonnage totals, and weekly session score totals, or weekly total AU. So it would just take the session score of each day and add them together. And so that's phase one. Phase one is isometrics. Please make note that none of these metrics for isometrics are going to be reflected in the data analysis charts. The reason for that is because isometrics are really just about pain modulation. Go back to phase one here. And we're not necessarily trying to build from week to week to week in regards to our progression of isometric exercises. This phase one is only a week long. It's just to introduce them to the load and hopefully to increase their load tolerance so they can move to reps. So these numbers are really just for your reference in the moment. If you're in phase one, you can have those metrics for the athlete and for you. Now let's move on to phase two metrics. Very similar, but I've got a day here filled out. So this athlete did high bar back squat, belt squats, and split squats. And these are all the numbers that they actually did here. So you can see that exercise tonnage, average intensity, which is a new one now. Average intensity is the weights utilized divided by the number of sets. So it's the average of the loads here across all the sets that they did. Absolute intensity is the same as phase one. It's the heaviest weight that they use for that particular exercise. So let's just say this athlete finishes with a set of 15 at 225 pounds. Watch these metrics over here change. Boom. So exercise tonnage goes up. Absolute intensity now goes up because that was the heaviest set. And average intensity went up as well. So it all auto calculates. And for all 3 exercises, you'll have those metrics. the heaviest weight that they use, the average intensity across the sets, and then the tonnage, which is sets times reps times weight. And then you've got daily totals, which just is a summation of those three things: tonnage, average intensity, and absolute intensity. And then we've got the session RPE and the session duration. Let's just say this took 90 minutes, calculates our session score. At the bottom of each week, we have our weekly totals: tonnage, average intensity, absolute intensity, and total AUs, which will be the sum of all the session scores each training day. These are all the same values as you saw up here because we don't have any of the other days. But if you start plugging in values, then these weekly totals will change. And these weekly totals are the totals that are reflected in these graphs: absolute intensity, average intensity, tonnage, AC ratios, our weekly session scores or arbitrary units, same thing. Now, so that was one day. That was week one, day one, week one. So that's what the athlete did on day one, week one. We've got all their metrics here. Let's say now it's day one of week two, and we've got some values here. We've plugged them in, and this athlete went a little heavier on all of the exercises. So that athlete is progressing, and which is good. And all of the values here reflect that. And then the session score does as well, because our RPE is up a little bit. The duration pretty much went from 90 minutes to 200 minutes. Maybe that's not realistic. Let's change that to 120. And so we've got a new session score, which is a little higher. Now, because we've got 2 weeks under our belt, we can start to look at weekly differences, weekly percentage differences. And remember, in the user manual, we suggest staying under about 10% increases from week to week in regards to tonnage, average intensity, absolute intensity, and total AUs. This is just a glitch here. This should have a value. It would auto-populate, so it should work on your end. So we get all of our weekly metrics, and then we get to see how this week's metrics compared to last week's metrics, and we have increased by this much in these metrics. Now, let's say this athlete just went ham on this last set of high bar back squat, and he did 400 pounds for a set of 15. Let's see what that does down here. Oh, it changes things. So if these weekly percentage differences go over 10%, then this value will turn red. And so that crazy increase in intensity jumped everything. And it's not, red light doesn't necessarily mean that athlete needs to never do that again or needs to stop training completely. It's just, it gives you a visual to just be mindful of the increases. So let's change that back to something more reasonable, maybe 275 and 10% there at absolute intensity. So we're just at that threshold. We're just under here. Let's change that to 290. Let's see what it does. There we go. So going a little heavier on that last set. Now we're at 13% for absolute intensity. We're approaching 10% for tonnage and average intensity, but just know that, okay, let's say the athlete's symptoms increase a little bit after this training day. Well, maybe we just went a little bit too heavy on that last set of squats. Hopefully that makes sense. And then down here, the data analysis, this is a demo tab, meaning this is what these graphs will look like if the entire template was filled in. So just know that. Weekly absolute intensity, we'd probably be looking for increases from week to week, because in phase 2, especially the loads are decreasing. The loads are increasing and the volume is decreasing as far as reps. And then the red line here that you see on every graph is session RPE. So you just get a visual of how the athlete is rating their internal load versus the external load, which is the weight on the bar. So let's say you have several weeks where the blue bars are very, very high. So the weekly absolute intensity was very high, but yet the red line was very low. Maybe that means the athlete is perceiving the exercise as easy and they're recovering well, which is maybe a good thing. And but let's say it's the other way around. This red trend line is spiking up, and then these blue bars have steadily either declined or plateaued. Maybe that means the athlete is not recovering from training and they're perceiving their training sessions as very hard compared to the work that they're doing. So you might need to adjust the load. Ideally, what we would see is just kind of a trend. The SRPEs go up as the average intensities go up, but there's no acute spike. And you would see the same thing with weekly average intensities. And so let's say an athlete just can't quite handle big spikes in weight, so you're not able to build intensity from set to set, but at least they can handle sets straight across, or maybe slightly lighter loads, but just repeating those loads across. And so maybe average intensity is the metric that you are looking for improvement on in the early stages of rehab. And it would be the same conversation. And then tonnage, same idea. So this can be variable. If your goal of the specific week or phase is to increase intensity, and then maybe you drop a set. If that's what you do, if you're doing less volume, then you're probably going to see tonnage values go down. This is not necessarily bad. Tonnage is just volume of work. So it's sets times reps times load. And so that's going to fluctuate based on whether the goal is to build volume, to build more sets and reps within a given intensity, or to build intensity. And then this blue dotted line that you see on every graph as well is just a trend line. So it'll automatically turn blue if the trend is up, and it'll turn red if the trend is down. AC ratio, read this in your user manual for more detail. It's the acute to chronic workload ratio. So it is the AU, or the session score, the weekly AU session score of the most current week completed. So let's say an athlete just completed week 6 of the template. That goes at the top. That's the numerator. This is a ratio, remember. So the most recent weekly session total is the numerator, and then the denominator is the average of the 4 weeks prior. So we're looking at a 5-week block for AC ratios. AC ratio is basically a metric looking at the work that you're doing now, this acute work, so the most recent week, compared to what you have been prepared for, what you have done. And as we mentioned in the user manual, in team sport athletes, there's a quote unquote sweet spot of AC ratio in which you're not increasing risk of injury, but you can still make gains, is 0.8 to 1.3. So a 1 would mean that you're doing exactly the same amount of work than you have averaged in the past month. And a 0.8 means that you're acutely doing a little bit less work. Maybe it's a deload. And then a 1.3 would mean that you're progressing. You're doing more work. You did more work this week than you had in the average of the previous month. So it's that. Now, keep in mind that 0.8 to 1.3 that's the data that they found in team sports like rugby, Australian rules football, cricket, not barbell sport athletes. There's not specific AC ratios that we can say there's a sweet spot for barbell sport athletes. We don't have that data yet. So I'd rather you not memorize the 0.8 to 1.3 sweet spot metric, but rather look for spikes over time, that greater than 10% increase. So let's say you have an AC ratio of 1.2 in week 6, or let's say it's 1 or 0.9 in week 6. And then let's say week 7 was like way up, like a 1.6 or a 1.8. And then in week 8, the athlete started to experience an exacerbation of their symptoms. We can look back here and say, okay, during that week 7, our workload spiked a little bit, and our session score spiked a little bit compared to what the athlete had been prepared for. So that week we went hard a little bit. And then we can say, well, where do we go hard? We can start looking at average intensities or weekly absolute intensities or weekly tonnage totals to see if there's a spike there too. Because what made the athlete perceive their workload to be much higher? Let's say they did 4 extra sets that they weren't supposed to do just because they were feeling good that day and didn't realize that training is cumulative and it can add up over time. So that's what we're looking at with the AC ratios. And the weekly arbitrary units is the same idea. So you're just taking the weekly totals of session score and you're tracking the percentage difference from week to week, just like you have been for tonnage, average intensity, or absolute intensity. So it's the same exact thing. And our AC ratios, just so you have context, the AC ratio is basically just a function of these weekly session scores. So it would be like This would be week 6 here would be your denominator or your numerator. I'm sorry. This would be your most recent week completed, your acute load. And then your denominator, the chronic load, would be the average of these last 4 weeks. So hopefully that AC ratio makes sense to you. And then this is the data analysis tab that will actually be live and changing for you week to week. It looks a little funky right now because I only had those 2 days in phase 2 populated, but this tab will look somewhat like this tab when the athlete is going through from week to week. Hopefully that makes sense. Just a quick note here, in phase 3, when the athlete is starting to do weightlifting, so let's say they're doing cleans, they're going to do a pull. We're going to do 1 set, 5 reps, 200 pounds. I'm just making stuff up. But that's what I'm prescribing the athlete to do. What they actually did was 1 set, 5 reps, 225, because that's what athletes do. We will get the same data. Please make note that the dynamic exercises, the dynamic loading, the clean, the snatch, the jerk variations will not be reflected in the daily totals, will not be reflected in the weekly totals, and will not be reflected in the data analysis tab. The dynamic loading exercises, these clusters for the clean, the snatch, the clean, and the jerk, these clusters are not included in those metrics because the loading will be so variable. If there's any weightlifting coaches here or any clinicians that work with weightlifters or have rehabbed yourself in weightlifting, you'll know that sometimes it's just lots of sets with the empty bar. Sometimes it's very small increments of change. Sometimes you're just doing just this feel out process. So we just found that would be very difficult to track linearly the way that these isotonics would be. So these metrics are really just, it's similar to phase 1 with the isometrics. These are just for your reference to go back on so that you know, oh, I'm going to repeat that clean cluster this week. Let's see what I did last week. It's just not reflected in the week to week progression. I hope that makes sense. But on this same day, the isotonic exercises will be reflected just like normal. They will be reflected in the daily totals. They will be reflected in the weekly totals here. Okay, so hopefully all that makes sense, guys. I know that's a lot. Read through the user manuals, watch this video again, play around with the template. It will make sense. It probably seems complicated right now, but I promise you, it's this template will make things much more simple for you to track overall trends over time. And that's really the idea here is looking at the big picture of rehab. So we will talk soon. Thanks, guys.